Hey everybody, welcome to a Signal 65 Video Insights. I'm Ryan Shrout. I'm the president of Signal 65, and I'm joined by a host of guests today. We've got an awesome topic that we're going to talk about and run through. First up, I've brought in Russ Fellows, who is our VP of the Data Center Labs Group. Russ, welcome.
Thank you.
We've also got two other special guests, Matt and JV. I want you guys to introduce yourselves and tell me a little bit about what the company is and what you guys kind of do on a day-to-day basis when you're not talking to us here at Signal 65.
Sure, I'll kick it off. Matt Wallace, I'm the co-founder and CTO at Kamiwaza. Kamiwaza builds a generative AI engine for the enterprise that allows us to help enterprises deploy workloads at scale, operate them with a lot of operational consistency, with a data engine that allows them to tap into all their enterprise data sources and really make it easy to build and operate apps on top of that. We also, through collaboration with Signal 65, have a pretty fantastic platform for doing qualitative and quantitative testing.
So I'm JV. I'm one of the engineers at Kamiwaza. On a day-to-day basis, I usually help build some of our tooling, agentic workflows. Also, one of the core people working on our test platform. So collaborating with folks like Signal 65 often.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. So we wanted to bring you guys in to talk about one of the recent papers released just a couple of weeks ago, the new AI Accelerator economic landscape. Russ wrote this paper for us, did some AI testing of the new Intel Gaudi 3 AI Accelerator. And we want to kind of talk through some of the implications of that testing, what it might mean for the future of kind of the AI landscape and maybe Intel in general. Some of my key takeaways as I'll say as an outside observer watching you all work on this and come to some really interesting conclusions, right, was that I was kind of surprised to see that the Gaudi 3 accelerator was performing as well as it was relative to the competitive comparisons. In this case, we were using an NVIDIA H100 platform in some of the specific tests that we looked at. And then obviously that led us down the discussion of performance per dollar and kind of the value that the Intel solution can really provide. I'll kind of lean into some questions and kind of probe you guys for some interesting answers and topics here. I'll start with you, Russ. I'm very curious about the testing process that we used. Matt and JV kind of referenced the Kamiwaza platform as well. But I'm curious, as we continue to expand and improve our AI testing capabilities at Signal 65, kind of how you felt that went for this round of performance measurement.
Yeah, I think it went very well. So Kamiwaza developed that test suite, and they're still, enhancing it and adding to it. But what it really allows is to do very structured, repetitive testing. So instead of just ad hoc, one-off, hey, let's try this, you can have an automated test suite that goes through and tests things in a very structured way. So you can test different input and output parameters, the shapes, as you like to call it. So that really allowed us to test things in a very structured way and do a very thorough analysis, looking at the two different accelerators. Instead of, that's probably not the way that it would be done in an enterprise. They would just try things, which is good and fine. But, having a structured test approach is very important when you're trying to do official testing, right? So that was a very critical piece of this and something that we're grateful to the two gentlemen on the call for helping develop.
Russ, can you explain to the audience kind of what the general overview of the configurations that we used for this testing were? I've mentioned already we're looking at Gaudi 3 in the H100, but we're looking about one accelerator, multiple accelerators.
Right. Yeah. So we this was a single system with 8 GPUs in both cases, the competitive NVIDIA H100 and also the Gaudi 3. Now, a little bit difference in the networking in that the interconnects are different on those GPUs, but that's not really that pertinent to it. It's kind of an interesting side fact. But the Gaudi uses Ethernet connectivity, whereas the NVLink by default for the Gaudi. But other than that, they were the same. The same base platform, not the exact same processors, but similar amount of memory on both systems. And then obviously the GPU differences. So 8 GPUs in both cases. And yeah, we were able to test as many as we wanted, 1, 2, 4, 8 GPUs. For some workloads, you only need a single GPU. For the larger models like 70B and so on, you need to use all 8 GPUs.
And it's interesting, right? Because we're basically, whether or not you're looking at on-prem configuration or cloud configuration, we're basically looking at one server node with 8 accelerators in it. I'm kind of curious, like, what do we view as the use cases for this kind of solution, right? Is it,
Right.
emerging enterprise customers that are kind of, as we talked about earlier, kind of playing around with AI for the first time in their business? Is it really, could you use it for deployment? Is what kind of target segments are we thinking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think a lot of people are wondering that, and just a month or two ago, I was wondering that myself. I have a little bit more answers now. In that, I was a bit surprised in how much you can really do with a single node with 8 very capable GPUs. You can do quite a lot. Having more, of course, can help you because AI is a very scale out problem. So having more GPUs allows you to do more things faster. But the scaling out complicates things. So it's much simpler to just do everything on a single node. So it is, you can do a lot with a single node with 8 GPUs. There's some things that you can't run, but you can do quite a bit. You can do some fine tuning. You can't do full training, but you can do fine tuning and things like that. So it's a great, starter system. And in terms of inferencing, you can get some pretty high rates that would support, hundreds of simultaneous streams. So that's a pretty good starting point for a lot of smaller enterprises, I think.
Interesting. Matt, JV, I want to come to you with some thoughts on your observations of working on this project with us, and kind of implications around I don't know if this was the first time you're working on Gaudi 3, but it was one of the first times anybody's really been working externally on Gaudi 3. So I'm curious to get some observations from you, maybe term, kind of ease of use or performance or what we saw on the software side that was interesting.
Yeah, we had done a little bit of work with Gaudi before, mostly with the Gaudi 2s, because part of what Kamiwaza does is normalize across platforms, right, to be hardware independent. So it's not specific to that platform. But certainly, like, the amount of bang for the buck, if you will, or the amount of VRAM that you can have for running models on an 8-way with a Gaudi 3 is pretty amazing. And I think it becomes really interesting for the enterprise because what we find, I think, with a lot of customers is, unlike somebody like an OpenAI or an Anthropic, right, where the GPUs are on fire all the time and there's all these API calls, for the enterprise, I feel like it's much more about having the best intelligence they can have in the data center that they operate. And so it's not really about how fast can we serve a request all the time. Sometimes it's about what's the best model that we can put into place, like having that space, that capacity to put in the kind of biggest, smartest model, because we know parameters like, if you scatter plot this, it's not always true, right? But as a rule, the bigger the model is, the better it performs, right? And over time, there's kind of this leapfrogging effect where you see small models get bigger. Then there's this new flagship model that comes out, and it kind of stuns us with what we can expect from open models. And I think certainly with our customers, a lot of times there's this really disjointed amount of value they're getting out of their AI projects, right? Where, yes, it may cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase a system, but they're seeing that ROI pay back like almost immediately. Like the very first use case, they find ways to kind of save or earn, orders of magnitude more than that. And then they kind of get their sea legs and they build more. And so really great way, not only to have a variety of different workloads running, right? Because if you have all that hardware, you can obviously deploy many different models, but then also to really, kick the tires on those flagship models and figure out what makes the best sense for your business case without being constrained and without having to take all your private data and just shove it into a cloud, not really necessarily, being compliant with your policies and your obligations and so on and so forth.
Yeah. JV, I'm curious, we looked at Llama 3.1 for this testing, And I know that there were some kind of interesting scenario comparisons about inputs and output sizes on it. Did you find anything there that was kind of showcased a Gaudi 3 advantage or an H100 advantage either way?
Yeah. So primarily what we saw was that Matt kind of touched on this earlier, was because there's about 50% more VRAM available in Gaudi 3 compared to the H100, right? So this extra VRAM really helps load just more batches into Gaudi 3. So we get far the maximum throughput numbers we were getting is just from an absolute performance perspective is a bit crazy. Like we could get we can measure like 100K tokens, right? Which is not which isn't like a typical like accelerator
Right.
throughput you'd see, right? So this would be very useful in cases. Now, of course, the batch sizes are really great at giving you that insane throughput number. It does come with the caveat of increasing latency. So that's really useful in cases of where you're doing like batch inferencing, not necessarily, for example, real time. Like Matt said, for most enterprises, they wouldn't be like Anthropic where the servers are on fire because they literally have like millions of inference requests per second all over the world, right? But what they would need is, on a day-to-day basis, it's going to be like just the smaller batch, higher latency responses needed for chatbots. But then they would also have like batch processes, maybe even agents working behind the scenes 24/7, where it's not necessarily about the latency, but it's just about just how many tokens at a time can we generate as fast as we could, right?
Right. Another interesting observation that I saw, again, kind of watching this process take place over the course of over a few months, is it seemed like we were seeing pretty noticeable changes in the software tool sets, the tool change, how they've changed and improved. I'm sure that's the case from when, Matt and JV, you started working with Gaudi and Gaudi 2, even into Gaudi 3. But Russ, I would say even in the time that we've been testing it for this project specifically, we've seen some improvements.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll start, and I know Matt and JV have a lot more experience on this, but just what I've noticed from being a moderate AI practitioner or a, burgeoning, hopefully, practitioner is the number of new inferencing servers and the rate at which enhancements are being made. I mean, to the existing ones, enhancements are occurring, weekly, and new inferencing engine seems to appear monthly, right? Trying to compete with the other ones, seems to be a change, which is good because previously all the emphasis seemed to be on training, like who can come up with the first trillion parameter and 5 trillion. Okay, great. But now the emphasis seems to be on inferencing, which is really good for enterprises. So that's good just to see a lot of competition, and VLLM keeps upping their game in TGI and SG Lang and 17 others.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think it's interesting because we've kind of been through from the very first time we were touching Gaudi, I think now 4 or 5 major releases of the underlying Optimum Habana library that drives their inference engine under the hood, right? And that's the library they have that kind of tracks along with transformers and enables all of those engines to do their thing, right? But also, we watch them add support for additional engines. Like when we very first kicked off our efforts, there wasn't yet support in VLLM. And we know that the Intel team worked to kind of build the VLLM support into the product. Yeah, so kind of seeing that evolution, supporting more engines, supporting these more popular engines, bringing along support for new model architectures. There's obviously this like continuous march of progress, right? Which you absolutely want to see.
It brings me to one of the topics that I want to get some opinions from anybody that has some on this is the, we looked at this, and everybody should go to signal65.com and go find this paper and read it. We show performance, and the Gaudi 3 servers and accelerators that we've looked at show amazing performance. They have amazing performance per dollar. I think, the cost considerations that we were looking at here, Russ, getting pricing for kind of this kind of server hardware is a little iffy. It's a little squishy is a term I use a lot to describe it,
Mhm.
right? Because oftentimes, prices you can find online may not be what you're paying if you're going to buy a couple of $1 million worth of hardware. But we were looking at basically a factor of 2x in the performance, or the pricing rather, of the H100s versus the Gaudi 3 platforms, right? And
Right.
so that translates into a tremendous performance per dollar advantage for these maybe more cost sensitive enterprises that are getting into AI for the first time for this deployment. Um, did you see anything else in particular, Russ, that stood out from a performance or performance per dollar standpoint, particularly?
Well, like you said, the price performance I think is really important. And, as the landscape kind of homogenizes and all of the differences are peanut buttered over within the different inferencing engines, hopefully, the hardware underneath will be close to invisible, which is ideal because then you can go to your favorite cloud and pick whichever instance you want based on price. And if Gaudi 3 is the cheapest, of course you're going to pick that, because why not? Because the results are going to be 99% the same as another one, right? We're not quite there yet. I mean, the software needs to mature and get built out into everything, but that's definitely happening rapidly. And I think we have some information about cloud providers that are going to be offering Gaudi 3. There's a whole bunch already offering NVIDIA, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
once it becomes prevalent, I think it'll be a lot easier to do a cost comparison because the prices will be right there on the website.
I think it's really interesting, actually, just to think about the market and how there's this perception, for some people that NVIDIA is like the only thing that exists, right? And obviously, one of the things that people are realizing is that the space for hardware to do inferencing is like almost untapped, right? Because we're in the earliest stages of enterprises getting to that game at large scale, right? In the broader enterprise ecosystem. And so it really looks like there's room for lots of things to flourish. And I think it'd be normal to see, differentiation evolve. And in fact, even the idea that, people might want to have the tools to evaluate other platforms, to switch platforms, to normalize, right? That's one of the reasons why our stance was to support all of those hardware platforms the same and normalize at the API layer, right? So deploying a model is the same API call regardless of what the underlying hardware is. And I think it gets into the interesting point, right? Looking at the numbers from this report, there are spots where when you're looking at that, dollar performance for those types of workloads, a tool set like the one we employed could let us go and figure out what the performance was for different use cases. And I think that's always good advice for any kind of enterprise undertaking, right? Is to really evaluate things in the context of your workload. And then when you find, cases like this, you can find, these gems that deliver much better performance per dollar, like we saw in this case for these use cases.
Excellent. I think what I get asked about a lot is what's Intel's long-term prognosis in this area, right? And I don't want to dive too much in this video into what is their roadmap, and is Gaudi the future, is GPU the future? They just got a new CEO today, right? Who knows what's going to happen and shift in that market? But what I do know is, by going through projects like this, by seeing the iterations, both the improvement in hardware and the improvement in software, it paints a much more positive picture for Intel in the data center AI space than I would have had several months ago. Is that something, Russ, that you would agree with?
So yeah, I think it was very important to have proof points of, because Intel has been talking about Gaudi 2 previously and then Gaudi 3 for quite a while. But especially on Gaudi 3, there was a lot of talk about it without having anything in the market. So having something out there that people can get their hands on and use and show that, yeah, the performance really is good, is very important, right? Especially when you're a relatively new player in the game, that they are to the GPU market. So obviously not in the processor space, but
Super excited about more. Yeah, I'm super excited just about more competition, right? Because the last thing any of us want to see is an ecosystem dominated by big players. I mean, I think that's why we are so jazzed about how much the ecosystem of open source models has flourished. If you just sit back and you can be blown away by the fact that you can literally download something, it'll run on like a typical, home computer GPU that completely outperforms like the original GPT-4, and you could just run it on almost any hardware. And like that, obviously everything is improved, and the yardstick keeps moving with the reasoning models, which I guess this has been all the buzz lately. Driven by some of the big reasoning model releases that started with OpenAI's O1. But it's like whatever you thought the market was for inferencing too, right? Whatever you thought your need was for GPUs, probably going through the roof, right? Because now you can have models where you can literally turn the dial and almost arbitrarily, use what they call test time compute or inference time compute to get the model to give you a better answer, because it essentially iterates in its own mind, if you will. I'm going to go ahead and use the term, even though we know it's not really a brain, but to drive that like better answer for the end user, right? And so that's great for us as consumers of language models. We get better outcomes, but it also means better budget for a little more hardware, because you're going to blow through a lot more tokens that way, because those things count.
I agree. I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward. We've got lots of other kind of programs and testing lined up for different accelerators and models and everything. So we'll talk about those in future videos. But I'm really looking forward to it. Russ, thanks for coming on and talking about your paper. By the way, signal65.com. If you go to our research section, you'll see the new AI accelerator economic landscape. It's definitely worth taking a read and getting up to speed on what Gaudi 3 is and how it stacks up in the landscape. And then Matt and JV, really appreciate the time and really appreciate you helping us, build out this test platform. It's been great. We're looking forward to doing working more with you going forward.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us on.
And that's going to be it for us. Thanks to everybody for watching. Again, signal65.com. Check up on all of our AI testing and research, and we'll catch you in the next video. Thanks.